will recall that the last limud ended with a machlokes between the Chai Adam as brought by the Mishnah Berurah in the beginning of Siman Reish Yud and Ramoshe in Shuvas Igris Moshe. For those who have the Marmakomis sheet from last week, you will recall that we had discussed what the Mishnah Berurah brings from the HaRav, primarily based on the Magen Avram, in the question of whether or not various achilos of different foods and various shtiyos of different mashkim can be mitzdaref. And the general klal was that achilos in general can be mitzdaref, shtiyos in general can be mitzdaref, and achila and shtiya in general is not mitzuref. The Mishnah Berurah brought from the Chai Adam a shaila: if someone is eating an oichel and at the same time eats maya de shalke, he eats vegetable broth, or he eats, according to the Rosh, fruit broth, if it's not from Shivas Aminim, can that maya de shalke be mitzuref to the oichel? And what we derived from that suffix of the Chai Adam is that the Chai Adam considers that maya de shalke, despite the fact that it's in the form of mashke, since, as we derived from the Shitas HaRosh, and we showed that Kipshuto, the Achronim Amavur, that all the Rishonim agree to this basic premise, that the reason why maya de shalke has the bracha ber pri Adam is because it's considered a chelik of the achilas of the oichel, the achil of the yarek. So therefore, the Chai Adam is mesupek that where maya de shalke is eaten together with another oichel, that the maya de shalke should have the din of an oichel such that it can mitzuref to the oichel in bracha achrona. We concluded the limud with the shita of the Baalei Gris Moshe, where Moshe is chelik b'toikef on the Chai Adam, and he says there is no tzad whatsoever that the maya de shalke should become mitzuref together with an oichel. And he says the reason is because as much as maya de shalke may or may not be considered an oichel, soif kol soif, the shear of bracha achrona for maya de shalke is defined by the shear of mashkim, which is a revius. And therefore, zok the Igris Moshe, and this is based on the Pri Megadim, the klal of what allows the tziruf of achila or oichel and oichel, or oichel and mashkim, is because where it's not, in the case where it's not achshure oichelhu, it's because the shear of the bracha achrona for both is the same. So Zot Moshe, even if we'll say that maya de shalke has a teiras oichel, but soif kol soif, legabe all its shiurim, and we'll discuss the shear of bracha rishona as we continue Beis Hashem today's limud. But when you get to all halachas of shiurim, it's treated as a mashke. So therefore, Moshe said it's not possible that it will be mitzuref to an actual oichel. Says Lashon of Moshe is the haposhut she'afshem mevorcham al hamayim shebishlum b'mirokos ekofshu bohem boire pri ha'adama. Even though the bracha of shlokas is boire pri ha'adama, mikamakam le'inyan bracha achrona shiurei b'revius. And therefore it cannot be mitzurah for the oichel, and therefore the Baalei Gris Moshe says so Ramoshe has made a hanocha, which Ba'atzem is not mefurish in the Paiskim, that even though Zot Ramoshe shlokos the bracha achrona is the bracha rishona is b'er pri hadama, and perhaps you would consider it an oichel in terms of its bracha, but b'neger to shiurim, the shear is b'revius. Now, this etzem shaila of what the shear b'neger to shlokos is, dahainu, is it a shem oichel only for its chashivus of bracha, or does it have a shem oichel even b'neger to shear? So we'll begin, and I apologize because of a technical difficulty. I wasn't able to photocopy and provide for the Olam a copy of the Eshel Avram from the HaRav. But the Eshel Avram discusses B'didei this Shaila. Fascinating Eshel Avram. Just read that. I apologize again. I'll just read oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Shlomo. Yeah. The klal is that when it says Pri Megadim be'Eshel Avram, it means the Eshel Avram and the Pri Megadim. When it says Eshel Avram alone, it means the Buchacha. That's the way to distinguish. Thank you. So the Buchacha said that he had a. I'm good. Yes, good. I'm good. Thank you. See, he had a minig. He says that Meish Lokois Sha'ani Goimon B'Shachris V'Hin Chamin. So the Buchacha had a minig that in the morning he would, as it will be clearer in the Eshel Avram Behemshech, he would take some spoonfuls of Meish Lokois. That was his. That was his breakfast. That he took some meish lakos, v'heim chamin. So zok the Eshel Avram. He says, yesh gam ken sofek ulai hashir b'revius b'chdei achilas pras. Oy rak b'kizayis b'chdei achilas pras, umikol shekein maya the shalkei shenira sheyesh ledoinom kemachol lezeh. The Eshel Avram is touching on a very broad shaila in HILCHOS. When we know that the shir b'negea for bracha achroina for oichlin is b'kizayis and for mashkim is b'revius. Yeah. In order that there should be a tziru for a kizayis or bracha achroina, we need that the kizayis should be nechal b'chdei achilas pras. That's the askomas hapaiskim. The shaila is when one is being shoyse a revius for chiyuv of mashkim, for bracha achroina, chiyuv bracha achroina for mashkim, what's the shear in which the time span in which that revius has to be consumed? There are Shittas Rishonim that hold that the shear is also b'chdei achilas pras, even though it's not an achila, it's a shtir. Other Rishonim hold that the shear is kedei shtias revius, and there's a discussion in Achronim exactly how to define what kedei shtias revius is. So the Buchacha Rav is being mesupik essentially in Ramosha's Shaila. What is the shear for bracha achroina for meish lakos? So Zod the Buchacha, it's part, if we consider it mashkim, so it should be part of the general shaila, is the shear revius b'chdei achilas pras, or is it b'chdei shias revius? Zod the Buchacha bin svara is b'chdei achilas pras. Not just revius b'chdei achilas pras, but kazayis b'chdei achilas pras. Why is that the Buchacha? Shenira sheyesh ledoinom k'meichol lezeh. Zot the Buchacha, the sheer bracha achroina for meish lakos is exactly the same as an eichel. It's a kazayis b'chdei achilas pras. So his hanocha is, and at first he's only mitzaded like that, but tziruf other sveikas. We'll see later as we proceed. The Eshel Avram's maskana is going to be that the shear for shlokas should be kazayis b'chdei achilas pras. Now the obvious question is, which I think one of the London touched on last week, is how do we measure kazayis b'chdei achilas pras when it comes to meish lakos? Is it the volume in mashkim of a kazayis? We don't usually find such a shear. We'll have to see behemshech of the Eshel Avram how we'll measure that. But the Eshel Avram svara is that because Maya the Shalke have a din of Shalke, the shear should be legabe bracha achroina kazayis b'chdei achilas pras, and should be exactly the same as an eichel. Be'etzem, the same way as Ramosha says miswar it's poshet one way, the Buchacha says it's poshet and svara the other way, and neither has a raya for it. Neither have a raya. What we'll try in the Hemshech Halimud is to see if we can find other Makairas to be done in this fundamental shaila of whether or not the din of Maya the Shalki goes as far as saying that the actual achila itself is an achila of an oichel, not just the gabe bracha, Does it have a bracha b'er pri adama like the yerek? But even in its oifen in its dini achila, it has a din of an achila. If you continue just a little further in the Eshel Avram, the Eshel Avram discusses a very basic question about why the bracha on coffee and tea is a shahakoil. The bracha should be a b'er pri adama or a b'er pri ha'etz in the case of tea and coffee, because according to the Rashba, the derech is to turn them into mashkim, and according to Rosh, there's tam ki ikr. So why isn't the bracha on coffee and tea the bracha of the original bean or the original leaf? This is a very famous shaila which is credited primarily to the Tshuvas Panim Meiras. So b'toich dvarav, when the Eshel Avram is noisav and noisan in that shaila, after he discusses that, he says that the possible reason why we don't make a bracha of the original leaf or the original bean, and it's not directly our sugya, this part of the Eshel Avram, and we want to be able to proceed through the sugya of shlachas to the nafkamina b'negeh to truma, as we said last week, is he says possibly, since I've said Dr. Eshel Avram, that the Torah's oichel that shlachas has would then give it a shear of kazas v'chechilas pras. So he says perhaps the bracha of b'er pri hadama or b'er pri ha'etz in the case of shlachos is based on the fact that the source of the tam that's dissolved in the mayim comes from a kazayis v'chechilas pras of yerek and peiros relative to the mayim, which means when the yerek or the tree is mizbashel in the mashke, the quantity of peiros or yerokos relative to the total amount of mayim is a ratio of kazayis v'chechilas pras, and therefore that is what gives the maya the shalke its bracha of b'er pri adama, because the shear of oichel is a kazayis v'chechilas pras based shear. So therefore, whenever we say that on maya the shalke the bracha will be dependent on kazayis v'chechilas pras, what we mean is that when the maya the shalke was cooked and formed or created, the ratio of pri or yerek to mayim was kazayis v'chechilas pras. Even though, of course, by the time you're being sheisa, as we learned last week, Mishnah Berurah is mefurish, and the Tshuvas HaRosh is before that way, then one doesn't actually have to be oichel yerek. One could be oichel only the mei shlokos and still make the bracha. But what gives the mei shlokos the bracha is because it has tam of a kazas v'chechilas pras. A kazas v'chechilas pras has been the source of the tam. So Mela, the Eshel Avram b'seich dvarav is done that in the case of tea and coffee, you don't have kazas v'chechilas pras in the original coffee, in the original amount of, and therefore it becomes a shahako. So b'toich dvarav, again, the Eshel Avram comes back to the same svar, and again, I apologize, difficult to follow outside, but a technical difficulty prevented copying the Eshel Avram, and therefore he was maskana, again, he says, umizeh mashma de l'kulei alma me kvoshim ushlokois nidoinim kemachol ubekazayis bechechilas pras. The din of shlokos is always considered an oichel, and the shear would be a kazayis bechechilas pras.
I don't understand the ratio. Somebody doesn't understand the ratio. He has to explain the ratio.
The Eshel Avram goes into the ratio in detail and describes the calculation here. I'll just leave it because it's technical. But the Eshel Avram b'seich dvarav describes the exact calculation of how he arrived at his shiurim, and therefore he says, "Val kol ponim k'moishe b'kol me shlokos omru Chazal stam shehim k'shlokos." Chazal established the rule that me shlokos have the din of shlokos. V'hagvul b'zehu b'kazayis b'cher pras kanal. The definition would be based on kazayis b'chechilas pras, and therefore again he says the shear would be the gabi mashke. The din would, again, the shear would be, even though it's consumed in the form of mashke, the gabi zeh misharim b'kazayis b'chechilas pras. So kama v'kama pa'amim, the Eshel Avram is chayzer v'shayna, this chiddush, that the dvarov me shlokos, the shear is kazayis b'chechilas pras, as they state in the Eshel Avram. So ba'oifen that the Eshel Avram has a smach, and Misvara takes the opposite position to Rav Moshe, b'negea to how we consider the din of me shlokos b'negea to and benegea to the din of shear. Now, let's broaden the shaila. So far, we've been discussing the shear bracha achroina on shlokos, if it's revius b'chdei shtias revius, or it's kezayis b'chdei achilas pras, benegea to bracha achroina, with the nafkemina being, first of all, bracha achroina itself, and secondly, the shaila of the chaya odom, if oichlin of shlokos could be mitzurif to other oichlim or not. But we can broaden the shaila much more and really say that the question is fundamentally, do we consider shlokos as a mashke, which coincidentally has the bracha of its oichel, sauce, or shlokos are a mashke? Or oichel, I apologize, or an oichel. How do we consider it? And this should have an afgemina in kol ha'Torah kula. Let's go through some examples. Legabe kabolas tuma. Is it mekabel tuma as an oichel, or is it mekabel tuma as a mashke? Now, the olam looks surprised that we should ever consider a liquid as being able to be mekabel tuma as a mashke, but we have mishnayos as an oichel. But we have mishnayos. We have a mishnayos. Chishebal of the oichlin, it can be mekabel tuma b'teres oichlin. Chishebal of the mashkin, mekabel tuma b'teres mashkin. Pesus in Chulin of Lamed Zayin says a klal that in order for something to be mekabel tuma seichel, it has to be of. It has to have a solid constituency. But achronim amatmiya that places can't be understood kipshutoi, because they come a mishnayis that one can be mechashev on the liquid to use it in the form of food of an oichel, and it's mekabel tuma seichel. Perishim mishnayis. So memele, we have a basic shaila now. What's the stom of shlokos? Is it mekabel tuma like an oichel, or is it mekabel tuma like a mashke? We'll go on to see that the Chazon Ish is going to show that kipshuta this is a mefurish mishnah Masechta Teiros, and we'll try and see how that applies to HaRav. Another shaila d'oraisa: if someone consumes shlokas of macholas asuras, chas v'shalom, what's the shear? B'kezayis legabe malchus or b'revius legabe malchus? The shear of mashkim of iser, yain chule, is b'revius. The shear of all isurim shabbatayra of oichlin is b'kezayis. What's the shear b'negeat shlokas? Huadin legabe yom kippurim is the shear. Oichlin and mashkim are not betzuruf legabe yom kippurim. How are we done legabe achilas shlokas? Kama v'kama nafkeminas. The shear for bracha achroino deraisa we already discussed. Tziruf b'chdei achilas pras we already discussed. And then we can broaden the shaila to a number of applications in birchas hanenin also. The din is that yayin is poiter shar mashkim. We know, make a ber priagofen. All other mashkim are then considered toffel to the yayin. If someone makes a ber priagofen, does that part the soup? If it's mashkim, it should. If it's eichlin, it won't. Such a simple shaila. Someone makes a ber priagofen, and then he wants to eat a bowl of soup. Shlokas. Does it pater or doesn't it pater? What's it din? Huadin, if someone eats, if is shlokas automatically considered a mashke, like dvarim haboim b'soy chasuda. It's not as common now, but fruit soup in the summer, which is often served as an aperitif in a meal. If it's mashkim, then mashkim that abba b'soy chasuda are included in the birchas hapas. If it's oichlin, then it depends if it's boy machmas asuda or not. So if it's an aperitif, so it's psichas ha'ma'ayim and chanami, then it's boy, then it's a tzarech hasuda. But if it's just something that is a side dish, it's boy shalai machmas asuda again. How are we then done the negea to the din of fruit soup in a suda? So we have kaman afgeminis and hilchos brachos also in these fundamental shailas. Now, seemingly these are very basic shailas, but as we've already seen from the machlokes between the Ramosha and the Buchacher, these fundamental shailas and shlokas will have to be ma'ayin b'siyata d'shmaya achas la'achas in Rabbi Seinu Achronim to find giluyim to these most basic shailas. So let's begin with the basic shaila deraisa of Kabbalas Tuma. Oichlin u'mashkim legabe the din of Kabbalas Tuma. What's shlokas? So here we have a Maramakim in the Chazon Ish in the Masechta Tvul Yom, where the Chazon Ish says, l'chura, we have a Mishnah. The Mishnah says that if we have a tabshil of grisen, right, grits, right, which are boiled, so the Mishnah says the following: the soup, the liquid that's surrounding the grisim, that the grisim are submerged in. So it says like this: if the shear is mashke teifeach, if it's in a form of mashkim, and it's still teifeach, right, which means it can moisten, it's not sufficiently thick that it's considered solid. It's mashke teifeach. So in that case, the Mishnah says that it's mekabel tuma b'teres mashkim. Zot the Chazon Ish hine muvur the tavshel afilu of, even if the tavshel is relatively thick, right? When one cooks grains in liquid,
you
get a porridge. It's still thick, but if it's mashke teifeach, if it's moist enough, then it's considered chashivei hamayim sheboy mashke. So Zot the Chazon Ish, we see that l'chura, what something is boiled in, as long as it's mashke teifeach, it should have a din of liquid. It should have a din of liquid. It should have a din of mashke. Like kabbalas tuma. The nafkamin is if a tvul yoim touches it, how it's nitma. The oichel is nitma one way, and the mashkem are nitma with a choimer of a tvul yoim that makes mashkem tchila, that makes mashkem erishin.
There are a lot of chumras just by taris and mashke right away. I mean that's not a very strong.
No. The chumra is the level that a tvul yoim is metame mashkem. But what a tvul yoim is metame b'teres mashkim, even though that's a chumrah, that's based on the principles that govern b'kol haTorah kula what oichel and mashke is. That's the klal. They were geyser on them additional ways of being makabel tumah. But what defines mashke and oichel, that's universal. So Zot the Chazon Ish, l'chorah we have a mishnah that legabe kol haTorah kula shlokas are a mashke.
Is he talking like farina?
Something. Yeah.
There are two ways you can do it. Either you have farina, which is like a porridge.
Yes.
Which is going to be wet.
Yes.
Or you can talk about beans that you cook in water.
Yeah, so we're talking about grisim not mabushal b'mayim, grains that have been cooked in water, right? Now, the longer it's cooked, the thicker the water. No. The grisim. No. The Mishnah is mafurish. The grisim are in the mayim. It's a mix. It's a mix of grisim and liquid. Let's say you could. Why?
Something like farina you can't separate, so that's
okay.
Fine. But if you could strain,
well, we'll see. That depends. Well, let's get to that. You're saying if it's become one thick porridge where the grisim are no longer identifiable, they've been dissolved, or yeah, we'll get to that. Beis Hashem. Here we're talking about a much simpler case. And we'll be able to get to the case that you're discussing, but here we're talking about a simple case. You simply cook grisim in mayim, and there's grisim mixed in the mayim still, and they may well be be'ed in some form, and there's liquid around. Zot the Chazon Ish, I have a mishnah. Yeah.
But over here, the liquid that you made for the greasing, you didn't cook it to make a shlokas out of it.
True.
That's not the
Okay. Right. Okay. In Chanami. We're not necessarily discussing HILCHOS yet. That's your point. HILCHOS may depend on the machlokes rishonim what gives it the din of maya d'shalke. In Chanami. And you're saying the shitza rambam that you have to cook it for the sake of the mat, for the shitza rosh, that it has to be for the achila of the grisim. We have to know what the case was over there. That's true. But the Chazon Ish is saying if you want to know ba'alma, I see what you're saying. I mean, you're saying it won't necessarily be a raya because maybe that's a case where it wouldn't have a din of maya d'shalke b'chlal. That's why we consider it mashke. Okay, yeah. So the Chazon Ish himself will get to that. I understand what you're asking. I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you're asking right away. So the Chazon Ish first then discusses this a difficult Rashi, and we'll come back to the Rashi in the Magen Avraham. But the Chazon Ish, 7 lines down, at the end of the line, which begins with the words hamafarshim, at the end of the line is a comma and then the word umihu. Zot the Chazon Ish, umihu dafka le'inyan tumas mashkim. This whole discussion that I've shown from a Mishnah in Tyrus, that the roitev has a din of tumas mashkim, that's only been a get to Tyrus. Inyan siruf achila v'shtia, b'negeh to shlokas combining with an oichel, which is the shaila of the chaya adam and the bali anegris Moshe. Zok the Chazon Ish, he says nira the ein toli bedin mashkim. That doesn't depend on the kol haTorah dika din of mashkim. Ella gam mei peiros v'tzir mikre shtia. Even though legabi tuma it will be considered, we have a shaila, it will be considered mashkim, will be considered oichlim. But zok there, b'negeh to tziruf achila v'shtia, it will be considered shtia. Why? He says, v'im hu nitfal la'oichel kitzir shal gabe yerek. If it's consumed as part of an achila, like on top of an oichel, then it's considered oichel. And then zok the Chazon Ish, it's tolui imhu derech achila or derech shtia. Depends how you're consuming it. Depends how you're consuming it. So memele zok the Chazon Ish, something can be in and of itself mashke, but benegel to HILCHOS tzirufim, and therefore by extension, benegel to HILCHOS brachos, it depends on the oifen in which it's consumed. If it's consumed in the form of shtia, that's the kind of maisa that's being done, it's mashkim. If it's nechal, it's oichel. Now, the Chazon Ish is very vague. What is it? What defines exactly the parameters of when it's nechal or when it's nishte? What does it depend?
Is it a spoon?
Right, a cup. What's the Hagdara? Now, the Chazon Ish has one case which he clearly says where you can have mash being consumed, the teras oichlin, and that is mashka on top of an oicha where they eat them together.
We had this in the Shiner already.
Correct, which is
the Mordechai, the Legashtia. So when Mordechai in a cup.
So let's take that step. So from the Chazon Ish Akaponim, what we have is that even though we began saying that we should be ma'ayin, firstly in Kol HaTorah Kula, what shlokas are. So the Chazon Ish says we have a Mishnah that shlokas bizman shemashke tefeach is a mashke. Bisman that it becomes thicker, it's an oichel. So the Chazon Ish, those are all dinim b'negeya to tum and taira. Legabe oichel, it depends in the oifen in which it's consumed. Memela, just to add, ladina, Reb Chaim Kanievsky in Shoina Halachas, on that sofik of the Mishnah Brura b'shem the Chai Adam, if one eats shlokas together with oichlim b'negeya to tziruf, so Reb Chaim points out that according to this Chazon Ish, it should be dependent on if it's nechal. How it's consumed.
Whatever that means.
Without a clear definition of what oichel means and what mashke means. Now, the etzem makor hadvarim of the Chazon Ish, that we find that how something is consumed can change its bracha. The Yesod hadvarim is mavur in the Bir Hagra. If you look in the Maramakomis book on page 240. Let's
put it up, please.
We have a din that's mentioned in Shulchan Aruch, a familiar halacha from earlier in Perek Ketzad Mevarchim. We have the case of where someone is drinking shemen zayis mixed with a nigroin in order to affect a refuah in his throat. So the Mechaber Paskins, if one looks on page 240, Sif Daled, towards the end of the Sif, so it's Siman Reish Beis Sif Daled, if those who want to follow in the Mishnah Brura, in Siman Reish Beis Sif Daled, it says that if the person is mechaven to for refuah, then havele shemen iker umavarach ala bar priya eitz. Vim eine mechaven le refuah ela lachila. If he's eating a nigroin mixed with shemen zayis, just as an oichel. So he's mitigated the hezek of the shemen zayis, if we'll recall, by mixing it with a nigroin. In that case, the mechaber says, havali a nigroin iker. His intention is for the nigroin. The shemen zayis is just to enhance the nigroin. In that case, eine mevarach ela hala nigroin. What's the bracha on a nigroin? So what would we say? What should be the bracha on a nigroin? A nigroin should be a bar pri adama. It's shlokos. What does the Ramah say? What's the bracha on a nigroin? Was steht in Ramah? Steht in Ramah, shahakoil. Frek the bir agra, frek the goin. How could the bracha on nigroin be shahakoil? It's shlokos. As I frek the goin. Zok the goin on the word shahakol. You can see in the bir agra oisyud beis shahakoil. Afal gav deshom lametes mod aleph. Even though the Gemara in Bracha says in lametes, amrinon mayo de silka kesilka. Meishlachas have the din of bar pri adama. Mikol mokoim kevon de lishtia mevarech shahakol. Since the intention of the anigroin is to be consumed in the form of shtia, the bracha changes to a shahakol. And the Goin says, the Goin Kedarkoi gives us two Maramakomis. The Olam will recall. The first thesis, the first thesis is a thesis about Sheicha, where Tesis says that Sheicha should be buried in Mezainis, and one of the reasons why Sheicha Tesis has a Shahako is because it's made for Shtia. Zok the Goin, Tesis on the same Omid asks, what's the difference between Zeh Ba'alma, which is a Shahako, and Shlokos, and Tesis has V'yesh L'chalik.
Here's a chilik.
How are we supposed to know what the chilik is? Zok the Goin, Tesis just told you the chilik. It's like sheichar because it's made for shtia. Zeya is for shtia, and shlokas is for achila. Zok the goin, the whole bracha of shlokas, according to the Ramah, depends on whether it's in the oifen of shtia or the oifen of achila. So the Yesod Hadvarim that we can have shlokas being be'etzem, having the bracha of the yerek. Sometimes it would have a bracha of an oichel, and sometimes it would have a bracha like a mashke, depending on how it's consumed. Zot the goin, where does that come from? It comes from the bracha of sheichar. Where Tosfos says that be'etzem mitzad the dinim of shlokas, sheichar should be a bari minim mezainis. But because sheichar is always consumed in drink form, therefore it's a shahako. Masha einkein. In the case of a nigroin, it's also shahako. Where shloka is b'er priadoma because it's eaten b'teras eichel. What's magdir eichel and eichel? What's magdir? How it's consumed? Dvarim stumim in the gain. The loshen by a nigron happens to be shosi, but if you take it, so when and when not is meshlokas have a din of shtia.
Only one teretz and Tosfos, but we're taking this as the ikar.
Taking this as an ikar, correct? Yeah. So the interesting thing is that be'etzem we find in kadmonim a shaila of how exactly to define oichel and mashke b'negea to bracha, and the shaila was b'negea to someone swallowing a raw egg. And it's brought in Orach Chaim and HILCHOS Shabbos that swallowing a raw egg it soothes the voice. The shaila one can do it on Shabbos and Medini Refuah to be geimea abeya. It's eaten raw, swallowing a raw beya. Swallowing a raw beya. The shaila is that considered shtia, or is that considered achila? The nafkamina is one case where we find the Tshuvas discuss the shaila. The shaila is in Tshuvas HaRav B'samim, so later achron. The shaila is if one is consuming a raw egg and one has already made a bracha on yayin, does that pater the raw egg? Mitoras yayin being pater shar mashkin. That's the shaila. So the Tshuvas HaRav B'samim, and again I apologize I wasn't able to copy out this Maram Makom. He references a Tshuvas Chasam Sofer, where the Tshuvas Chasam Sofer discusses a shaila of the Plesi, Rabbi Yonasan who discusses a fundamental issue b'negea to how we're allowed to sell eggs to non-Jews. Because an egg, the Gemara says, is Evim and Achai, but it has a specific Zes HaKosov to be matter that Yisrael can eat it. But be'etzem an egg is Evim and Achai. It's about Yetzim and Achai. A Ben Noach is also Evim and Achai, doesn't have the heter. So Mela, how do we sell Beim to a guy? It's a Plesi shaila, it's a Chasam Sofer shaila. So that's a discussion, just the prat. So the Plesi has an eitzah, and the Plesi says because if consuming an egg raw is shtia, be'etzem, if someone takes evim and achai, takes bosso, that's evim and achai, a yid chas v'shalom takes evim and achai, and blenderizes it, so it's now in the form of mashke. So the Gemara in Chulin needs a specific zes hakosov to say that you're chayiv even if you drink Evim and Achai. If you consume it in the form of drinking, not in the form of eating. Zog the Plesi, haray by Ben Noach, there's no Gzeres HaKosov being oiser. So therefore, if a Ben Noach eats is goimeya, a beit zachaya, he did an act of shtia on Evim and Achai, and therefore there's no iser. Now the Chasam Sofer's obvious issue is that most akum are not being goimeya the beitzim. They're cooking them until they're solid, in which case they have a din of an oichel, and it's an achila, and so we're back to the problem.
1 second, the Gemara in Bechayros in the Vav has a half a minute b'cholav should be Evim and Achai. Some Achronim learn itself Evim and Achai, some else Yotzei, but according to this, problem with the Plesi.
Correct. The Chasam Sofer early in the tshuva discusses the issue of cholav by Ben Noach also. Correct. So part of the same tshuva. I'm just focusing on the part that's negea to a beyo, which is the end of the tshuva. So B'toich Dvarov, the Chasam Sofer discusses this hanocha of the Plesi. Is a beyo considered mashke or considered mashke or not? So the Chasam Sofer says, and I think you had referenced that Gemara before, that the Gemara in Masechta Beyo calls a beyo uchla de ifras. The Gemara calls it an oichel. So Mamela, the Chasam Sofer says, anyway, I disagree with the Plesi because swallowing a raw egg is considered consumption of a meichel. Zok the HaRav B'samim, that's all true to whether or not it's an achila v'shtia for kol yisurim Shabbat Torah. But avada legabe bracha, it's considered a mashke because it's consumed in the form of shtia. So we find already an echo of this shaila benegea to a much earlier nidin and how we consider the beya itself. Is a beya oichlin or is a beya mashkin? It's a nidin between the plasi and the chasam sofer benegea to the iser evim and achai lebnei noyach of a beya. Zok the HaRav B'Somim, but all that issue doesn't affect HILCHOS brachos because avad legabe HILCHOS brachos, it's considered a mashke. What's the svara sadvarim? So the svara we find in the kadmoinim is, and there's already a tshuva in the sefer called Koil Elio. It's a kadmoin svardi, where the Koil Elio says as long as something doesn't need to be chewed, it's considered mashke.
What?
It doesn't need to be chewed. It doesn't need to be chewed. Right? If it's put in the mouth and swallowed without chewing, then in that case it's considered a mashke.
Isn't that called goymoy?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Goymoy.
So, that would be called goymoy. Basically, it's just it could be effectively drunk, even if it's eaten with a spoon, or even if it would be eaten from a plate, not from a cup.
As long as
if
you what?
If it would just be swallowed without chewing, it could be just swallowed. If it's placed in the mouth and swallowed, or soup, right? A beya, all things which are swallowed. Now, correct. Now this, and we'll come back to this perhaps this will be negea, particularly for the sugya chima, which Hashem we'll try and just get to briefly later, will be very relevant for the many to determining like in HILCHOS brachos many foods, for example, ice cream. Again, which is swallowed again without chewing. If it doesn't have anything in it, it's swallowed again without chewing. According to the Hagdara of the Koil Elio, it could be if it's swallowed without li'isa, zot the chuvas HaRav B'Somim, whether or not we consider it like a kulan oichel or a mashke, and a dover korush, something frozen, something solidified. If it's considered oichel or mashke legabe dine tumun taro, we again have rayas mufurashes to that. But benegeta to the halacha of brachos, it would be considered a mashke. So ba'ofen that according to the Chuvas HaRav B'Somim and according to the Chuvas Koil Elio Akadmoin, the Hagdara would be if it has to be chewed or if it could be swallowed without. Now, you had mentioned before, benegea to the din of porridge, legabe HILCHOS brachos. Would it be considered a mashke or an oichel? So here, we have l'chora maramakim. On page 275 of the Maramakomis book, we'll see the lashon of the Mishnah Brura benegea to porridge, which will hopefully address the shaylas that you were asking before. So this is in Siman Reish Ches, in the Mishnah Brura in Sivkatan Chof Beis. So on the Maramakomis book, that's on page 275, the second column of the Mishnah Brura.
In one line.
So the lashon of the Mechaber is, we just see briefly the Shulchan Aruch on page 274. If we mix flour and water or other liquids, what's called porridge, or semolina, so the Mechaber says, if it would be thick, so it would be eaten, and it would be chewed, so seemingly the hagdara of whether or not something is an oichel or a mashke, legabe of the bracha, should be totally on the isa. There seems to be a strong makar for this in the lashon of the mechaber. The Mishnah Brura makes the mechaber lav dafka. So the Mishnah Brura lav dafka. Ta'afilu me'enoi of kol kach. Even if you don't need to chew it. Kevon she'enoi rach she'eroi rak l'shtia mevarach ala baramina mezainas. As I state in the Mishnah Brura b'shem nachrenim. So seemingly,
putting porridge back to a
correct. So seemingly the Hagdara doesn't seem to be if I actually have to be loyasit, but the opposite. Li'isa is lav dafka. It just means that as long as it's not so thin that the only way it can be consumed is by drinking it, in that case it becomes mashke. But anything thicker than that, that's already considered eichel. So it's a mevucha now, how to understand this Mishnah Brura, this Hagdara of the HaRav B'Somim and the Koil Elio, what exactly defines eichel and a mashkim. And the emes is ledina. This is a mevucha rabba in the paiskim. Given that we're not using the criteria of kol atera kulam to define what oichel and mashke is legabe HILCHOS brachos, we already have a Chazon Ish that establishes that We have a HaRav B'Somim that establishes that from the machlokes of the Plesi and the Chasam Sofer B'Negea to Uchla the Ifras of Kabbalah's Tumah V'Beya. We then need a clear hagdara of what's considered Oichel Umashke Legabi HILCHOS BRACHOS, and we don't seem to have a clear hagdara. It's a davar sosum oid in the Paiskim.
The shouting can also technically, you're not lawyers, so you see.
So the Chura, okay, no, so now let's go a step further. Now the Chura, based on what's mashma in the Mishnah Berurah, from here in Siman Reish Ches, we can't simply say it depends on whether or not it's actually chewed or just swallowed without chewing, because the Mishnah Berurah says L'isas lav dafka. Again, it will depend on thickness. So according to the Mishnah Berurah, L'maisa, how are we now done b'negea to Maya de Shalke? Should we say that Maya de Shalke, which is thin, would be considered oichel, and if it would be thick, if it would be thin, it would be considered mashkin, if it would be thick, it would be considered oichel. HaRav, the bracha is not going to change. In the case of the porridge, if it's thin, it's a shahakol, and if it's thick, it's a mazonis. In shlokas, we don't find any difference in bracha rishona depending on the thickness. But still, if something is an achila or shtia, seems to depend, according to the Mishnah Berurah, on the thickness. The tzarechim doesn't. It's varim stumim in the paiskim. So perhaps we'll see two further maramakomis, which will indicate that even b'negea to hilchos brachos, broader than we thought before, Maya de Shalke has a din of an oichel. So let's summarize to the point that we've reached. We began with the shaila of tziruf, of oichel, of shlokas to oichlin. The machlokes between the Igros Moshe and the Butchacher, if the shear is revius, b'chdei shtias revius, or kazayis v'chachilas pras. We then expanded that shaila to the din of bracha rishona. And we saw from the Chazon Ish that the fact that in Kol HaTorah Kula shlokas may be an oichel or a mashke legabi dinei kabbalas tuma doesn't define dinei brachas. It depends on the Chazon Ish on how it's nechal. We saw smach to that from the gra that anigroin is for shtia and shlokas is for achila based on the chiluk of sheichar. We then went on to show that the Tshuvas HaRav B'Somim discusses the machlokes between the Plesi and the Chasam Sofer b'negea to a beya, and says that's all b'negea to Isser Evim and Achai, but not b'negea to the dinim of brachas, and it's nichal and shamashkim. We discussed the Tshuvas Koila Leo that depends on the thickness. The Mishnah Berurah that seems to say that Li'isa is, the Tshuvas Koila Leo that depends on chewing. The Mishnah Berurah that qualified to say that Li'isa is lav dafka, but depends on the thickness, and therefore we remain with an open shaila exactly how to be magdir, achila and shtia, b'negea to these shailas.
Would you find the same shaila by dam? Like the Binyan Tzion says it's 3 tshuvas by dam, and he says it's different with koresh and not. Legabi by dam, you have also steers if it's previous or kazayas.
Yeah, that's part of this. This wouldn't get to the shaila also. Yeah, but that's again a broader shaila, but get to Kol HaTorah Kula. Just to say derech aga before we continue briefly to the next section of the limud. There's an exchange of letters between Reb Chaim Kanievsky and Reb Avram Ganchovsky on this shaila of the Chasam Sofer and the Plesi, how to look at a beya.
Where is this?
It's printed in the introduction to the Sefer Baral Moigim of Reb Avram Ganchovsky. There's a michta from Reb Chaim where he simply writes, Kedarkoi, how could there be a shaila? Of course a beya is an oichel. Aren't all oichlim measured kebeya? Simple guys. How could there be a shaila about this? The din of Kabbalah's Tumah is Kebeya. The din of Tamei Acherim is Kebeya. So many shirim of Eichlin are measured up here Beya. So you're measuring Eichlin up here Mashkim. How could that be? It's not like that. That can't dwarf. That just like Chavivas to Indian to mention that. To mention that child. What?
But the Chasam Sofer had Makayos.
Yeah, the Gemara. Yeah, no, the Chasam Sofer Pashas assumes it's an Eichel because the Gemara in Beya calls it Uchel. The place he understood not like that. He understood Uchel is that. But he asks, Yala Ladas should have a Shemashke. That's B'derech Hagav. But homios, let's see 2 further sugyas where we seem to have an issue halacha lemaise b'negea to how we considered shlokas if they're considered an oichel or a mashke. One is a machlokes between the Magen Avram and the Pri Megadim if the bracha made on shlokas of Paris will be included in the bracha of yayin. Someone made a bracha on yayin, a ber pragofen. Ordinarily, that's poiter shar mashkin. What about shlokas of Paris? Zok the Magen Avram, shlokas of Paris will not be potter al yidei the bracha of yain. Why? Because they're an eichel. They state in Magen Avram. And that the Pri Megadim is chaylik, and the Pri Megadim says avada has a din mashke l'gabi bracha. Even though its bracha is like the pri, but l'gabi all other dinim of bracha it has a shem mashke, one machlokes. That's a machlokes between the Magen Avram and Siman Reish Daled and the Pri Megadim in Siman Reish Beis. Time won't allow us to see that machlokes in detail, but we've touched on that nafkamina. But there is one further nafkamina which I think is worth just spending a couple of minutes on because it's very negel halacha l'maisa this nafkamina. On page 246 of the Maramakom, in the Maramakom's booklet, we have a din of the mechaber, a familiar halacha which will summarize the dinim of shlokas of meiperis. So the mechaber discusses
soaking.
The meishrias tzimukim v'teinim and meibishulam, shlokas of Paris. The Rosh is mesupek if the shlokas of Paris have a din of bar per eitz or a shahakal. So bracha rishayna is not the mechaber, we have an eitz. Shahakal patas b'diavad. What about bracha achrayna? If it's the shlokas of shivas aminim, so then the bracha should be, if it has a din of Paris, it should be me'in shalosh. If it doesn't have the din of Paris, the bracha will be bar nefashis. So the mechaber has an eitza. L'chein yorei shomayim lo yishte ela b'soich hasuda. Yorei shomayim should only drink shlokas of Paris in the middle of it during a suda. Frek the bir halacha, how can that be an eitza? What's the suffix? Is it shahakol because it's just zeh ba'alma, or is it shlokas? Now, if it's shlokas, what is it? It's Paris. What's the din of Paris that aboyim b'seich hasuda? Paris aboyim b'seich hasuda ordinarily require their own bracha. So what's the eitzah of being eichel b'seich hasuda? What's the eitzah? Let's see the bir halacha on page 247.
Doesn't he mean for the bracha achrayna, not for the bracha shein?
Let's see the bir halacha b'seich hasuda. Rotza loymar v'lo yitztarech lebracha achrayna. You'll pat to the bracha achrayna. The birchas hamazon patrosai. Ava bracha rishayna zok the bir halacha yitztarech lekulei alma v'afilu leharashba. You're going to need a bracha rishayna of shahakal even according to the Rashba. Why? Dilav hochimai takante. What did you change? You didn't help anything. The gabi bracha rishayna, you're still going to need a shahakal. Frek the bir halacha va'afal gav de besimen kufayin dal daf harbe poiskim de ein tzorich levarach ala mayim v'mashkim b'soich hasuda. So frek the bir halacha, what's the eitzah? Like it was just suggested. Perhaps the mechaber only is taking care of the problem of bracha achrayna, because now birchas hamazon will pata. But the issue is also an issue of bracha rishayna. What did you help in bracha rishayna? If you're going to consider it mashke, then fakert zot the bir halacha, then it doesn't need a bracha. If you're going to consider it peiris, it does need a bracha. So what did you help? The bracha achrayna you help, but not the bracha rishayna. Bambakasha that the bir halacha asks, what's the eitzah? Zok the bir halacha chidush pele. He says, "V'im kein loharashba." If you're going to say that it's a shahakol, lo yitztarech levarach ala bracha achrayna, aval be'emes nireh the afla rashba ein aleim shem mashke ela kuroitev hapeiros. It's considered oichel. And memele, even according to the Rashba, it's oichel be'emtza suda. It means even according to the Rashba that the bracha is going to be shahakol because it's not the derech, but what it is oichel, and therefore it's nichal on the bracha. It's mechayev a bracha of Paris b'soich hasuda. In other words, Rabbi saying, well, this will conclude the sugya of shlokas. Means we've reached the point that l'shitas harashba, that it's not the derech to be mevashal Paris, and therefore the bracha should be shahakol. That's only legabi bracha. But what it is Paris. B'soich hasuda, it's considered an achila Paris. Therefore, according to the Rashba, l'chura, if someone would be drinking mei Paris, it would not be potter al yidei the bracha of yayin, because it's Paris. It's Arachi and Tuva, this chiddush of the bir halacha. But the bir halacha is showing that this is a mefurish and mechaber. Otherwise, how did we solve the problem of the bracha rishayna? We solved the problem of the bracha achroina. That's not what we can clear it. Does it need a main sholish? Or does it only need a bar nefashas? So birchas hamazon will pater. But what happened to the bracha rishona? If it's mashkim, it's included in the suda. If it's oichel, it's not included in the suda. So now I have a shad. Do I have to make a shakel? It's considered to be like yes.
Another example of the lumdis embedded in the bir halacha, which.
So this is a davar nifla, which is mavur mitoich the bir halacha. So kum dechois lemaskanas advarim. It's actually a mavucha gedola in Rabbi Seinu Achronim how to be magdir b'negeh to birchas hanen in precise definitions of oichlin and mashkim. And Memela, and the Benegea, to finish with this, just Benegea to the sugya of Trima, which one of the Lomdim was asking, Benegea to the Shir Bracha Achroin of Trima. Pulverized Paris, where the bracha is Shahakoil. Shitas Rashi, that's the Ramah says, to that Trima, the bracha Shahakoil. What's the Shir Benegea to Bracha Achroina? What's the Shir Benegea to Tziruf? How do we look at it? Oichel or Mashke? The Hagdara that we have based on the Paiskim, the most accurate Hagdara we seem to be, based on the Mishnah Gura, is constituency. Depends on the thickness.
Depends on
the thickness. If it's something that can only be, it's that thin that it can only be consumed in the form of shtia, it will be a mashke. Anything less, the chayra would be an oichel. Chayra would be totally on the constituency. This is the Hagdara which seems to be oila. How to consider the dinim of all other nafkiminas of oichel and mashke. What does bracha rishona indicate when again to the din of oichel and mashke and the charetz and mevucha gedola? This is the point in which we'll conclude this. We'll conclude this chelek of the limud. There is fascinating Yerushalayim Masorah. A number of years ago was publicized in one of the periodicals in Eretz Yisrael. But the makor of this Masorah was that there was one of the Nikiya Das of Yerushalayim was someone called Rabbi Elio Shachar. Shachar, yeah. And he left over in his memoirs something that he heard from Rabbi Shai Cheshin, one of the famous Gedolei Yerushalayim from 3 days ago, where he related to that Rabbi Shai Cheshin related to Rabbi Elio Shachar, that he met a Zokin Echad, as he writes. He met an old man who he says was a melamed in the house of the Nitziv in Volozhin still. Someone who in those days it was common that people hired melamdim that were part of the household to teach the children. So he met someone who was a melamed for the Nitziv's mishpacha. I don't know if that means the Nitziv's own children. Like upon him, he lived in the house of the Nitziv, and this Rabbi Shai Cheshin met him and related the conversation to Rabbi Elio Shachar, and he told him like this. He said he heard in the Nitziv's house a Masorah from Reb Chaim and Reb Itzel of Volozhin, the Yastim of Volozhin and Reb Chaim Volozhin and his son, that someone who wants, in the Lashon that he writes it in his memoirs, is someone who wants tfilos of Yasu Peres. His tfilos of Yasu Peres. His tfilos should accomplish, Be'ez Hashem. He should be mis'aneh on Erev Shabbos Kodesh, Parshas B'chukaisai, and he should be makbid to finish being Mavis Sedra on that Erev Shabbos, and that has the koyach that his tefillah should be miskabel ba'ez Hashem Yisborach. So you have a Masorah ish mipiyish from Ritzel and Reb Chaim Volozhin through a Melamed who heard it in the house of the Nitziv to Rabbi Shai Cheshin to Rabbi Elio Shachar, and it was published about 15 years ago, Barach. These ksavim, and this was the Masorah. That somehow a tainus and bima v'sedra. So mikra bechatargum on Erev Shabbos Parshas B'chukaisai somehow has in it the koyach that tefillah should to create a koyach that tefillah should be miskab. But stay though. So that's an issue that in the poskim being misana erev Shabbos is garnish poshet. The feeling maskana nushvura one shouldn't be misana and tainus on erev Shabbos. Perhaps the chatzos if it was makom tzorich. Neither in the rochav in the poskim. We're not when this is not for halacha lemaisa, but just to perhaps try and touch to some of what's mavur here. The brachos of Parshas B'chukoisai end with B'salachti b'soichechem v'yisi lochem lelekim v'atem tiuli la'om. So state in Ramban, V'tam v'salachti b'soichechem zot Ramban shetia hanhagosi b'chem mefursemes. The hashgacha the Rebbeinu Shalom should be obvious. Kimelech mishalech b'kerev machaneu. Like a king amongst his troops, maspik lahem called sarkom. Klal Yisrael will be provided with all they need. This is what this. V'hu emes zot Ramban v'kach yase b'hem bevadei. That the Rebbeinu Shalom avada will be mekayim and give Klal Yisrael all the BRACHOS and all the tzrachim that they need. That is the ultimate bracha. V'salachti b'seichem v'yisi lachem lelekim atem tiuli la'om. Is a melech b'soich machaneu, that all the tzrochim of Klal Yisrael will be mekuyim ba'ofen goli. That's the tachlis of the brachas. So perhaps what state is that on Erev Shabbos, Erev B'chukoisai, to be able to receive the bracha that is nichlal in the brachas of Parshas B'chukoisai, the ultimate of which is that the Rebbeinu Shalom will be maspik called sarkon. Memele, the Messiah from Reb Chaim and Ritzel of Elazar is if one is mis'ana, one's shov, and one is mavri sedra, one is clear of these psukim that contain bracha, we could be zeicha to a me'ena b'salachti b'seicha v'yisilachem b'atem tiuli la'om. But perhaps there's another nakuda here, and that is that Reb Chaim Elazar in Nefesh Chaim, in the end of Shah Daled, is marich to explain the connection between Eisek HaTorah and Tefillah being miskabel. That one of the accomplishments that Limud HaTorah gives to the Oisek Ba is the koyach of Tefillah is being miskabel. He first proves it from the opposite, that Chas v'Shalom meisir oznoim midivrei Torah gam Tefillah Chas v'Shalom toyevo. But meidach gisa to the other side, that la'olam a person should be mispal in the same place that he's loimed. Chazisi reishach beinei amudi de garse. Gemara in the beginning of brachos. The even in the terms of the mokim, that there's a maila being mispal in the mokim halimud is again because Eisek HaTorah creates a koyach that tefillah should be niskabel. Harei the ikr inyan of imbuchu koisai telechu or chas v'shalom, the way Rashi brings the imloi sishmuli is amelus batayra or the opposite. So therefore, b'chukoisai, which establishes that bracha comes mitoch amelus batayra, one of the greatest brachas that amelus batayra gives us is that tefillah is niskabel. That's a koyach that's munach mitzad the mailas of Eisek HaTorah. Memela haroitze that tefillah should be oisa peiros is to once again be misboinen in imbuchu koisai telechu. Chas v'shalom mehepech v'imloi tishmuli, which Rashi says liyos hamelim batayra l'das medrash chachamim, is that amelus batayra or the hepech of it is goyrem tefillah being niskabel. The avoida of erev of Shabbos Parshas B'chukoisai is to be misboinen once again in how Eisek HaTorah is moil when again to Kabbalas Tefillah. And Mela, even if we won't be Mekayim Kipshutai because of the issue of Ladina of being Misana Erev Shabbos, but Akaponim to be misboinen, perhaps to be Mekayim Shnei Mikra V'chatagim Akaponim Erev Shabbos, but to be misboinen mitech the kriya that v'yisi lochem lelekim atem tiulu la'om is that the Rebbeinu Shalom will be Mekayim B'goli Tzarchei Amoy. Kimelech Mekar Machaneu Maspik Lahem called Tzarkom and Lashon of the Ramban, and the Iker Koyach of Tefillah being able to be Niskabel is Mikoyach Eisek HaTorah. And the Goyin is Chayzon and Sisoid in a number of places. Here in Shir Hashirim, brought in Eben Shleima, that one of the consequences Chas v'Shalom of Churban is Sosam Tefilasi, the way it's Mavur in Megillas Eicha, comes Mikoyach Malkeo v'Sorea Bagoyim Ein Torah. The mute of Klal Yisrael's Shleimus in Madregas HaTorah, which is also one of the consequences of Golus, has also led to the fact that there is a mechitza shebazel in the Lashon of Gemara and Brachos that's mavdil beinenu v'ein Abinu Shemaim sosam tfilas. The two inyanim are kshurim zeh b'zeh, because the koyach of tefillah being iskabel is based on imbechu koisei telechu. The ultimate bracha that comes from imbechu koisei telechu is misalachti b'seicha v'yisel ken remashgacha b'golu v'sapik kol tzarcheim. Perhaps that's some of what, if we could have Rishus to take something in from what l'chayr is the Kabbalah Mirabbi Seinu. Perhaps that's what Reb Chaim and Reb Itzal of Volozhin meant when they said that a chance to be mizboinen in the limud of Parshas B'chukoisei, Erev Shabbos Parshas B'chukoisei, is to be mizboinen how Melas B'Torah Be'ez Hashem is moil, but tefillas to be miskabel Rachim L'Ratzon.